Kira Vinke. And since I know that Kira is with us already, because I've seen her already, I'd also like to take the pleasure to introduce you to our today's audience. Dr. Kira Vinke heads the newly founded Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations, short DGAP. She also co-chairs the advisory board to the German federal government on civilian crisis prevention and peace building. Kira is affiliated as a scientist with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where she led the East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities Project before joining DGAP. Until 2018, Kira was a research analyst to the director of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. In this capacity, she worked from 2014 to 2016 as an analyst for the German Advisory Council on global change to the federal government. She provided her expertise as a consultant for the German Development Cooperation, shortly known as GIZ, and the Asian Development Bank. She holds extensive field research experience in South Asia, the Pacific, and the Sahel. Kira completed her doctoral dissertation, summa cum laude, at the Humboldt University in Berlin on the subject of climate change and migration. For her dissertation, she received the Potsdamer Nachwuchswissenschaftlerpreis, a prize for young scientists from the city of Potsdam. Kira, now that you're with us, I'd like you to present your findings and your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much, and please allow me to share my slides myself. I hope you can see it now.
Just wait a second. Yeah? Okay. We're good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this signal. I'm very pleased to be talking to you today and also to perhaps enter a discussion later on. And thank you so much, Mr. Beauregard, for your inputs, which really helped me to build my arguments. And before we arrive at today's situation of climate change, I want to add another perspective. I think Mr. Beauregard, he showed very well the terminology and the different concepts that underlie these words that we are using in this presentation also, and then our discussion. But I would like to add a few more points on what climate change is and why we're in such a crisis. And for this, I want to take you 100,000 years back, but it will go very quickly. So here you can see basically how, based on ice core data, so based also on the changes that could be analyzed from poles, change in temperature, we see that Earth is moving through a variety of climatic changes. So you can see here, about 70,000 years ago, we had very, very significant disruptions, which were related to a volcanic eruption of the Toba volcano. And in this period of time, Homo sapiens, our species, almost went extinct. And if we look at this time frame, 100,000 years, I'll just let our Earth jump through this period a bit more. 100,000 years is roughly around a third of the time that Homo sapiens is on Earth. So very long time period, but very interestingly, our civilization, our cities, the Neolithic revolution, where we became settled, where we started to do agriculture, only happened in this very last part here of the 100,000 years here in the Holocene, in the last 11,000 years, which is a period of great climatic stability. So you can see here, of course, there's also still changes during the Holocene time, but overall, this is a period of great climatic stability, which enabled us to do all these things that I just named, and which also then led to an increase in the global population, and which led to the establishment of human civilization. If you think about the oldest cities, they're only a few thousand years old, maybe 5,000 years. This means that our population rose in this time, and it's what we witnessed today was happening and started in this period of time. If you look at the same time period and look at how the composition of the atmosphere changes with regards to CO2 concentration, you can see here this extreme increase of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And maybe you're wondering, why is Dr. Vinke showing us like very old slides from 2007? Of course, this is from the IPCC report many years ago. And of course, this development has significantly continued. And we would now be actually outside of this graph because we have put so much CO2, a potent greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere and are therefore causing this extreme import of energy into our Earth system, which then is mainly also shown in global mean temperature change. Most of the energy actually goes into the oceans. So if the oceans wouldn't swallow so much of the energy of the heat, then we would have had much more significant mean temperature changes in the air, in the atmosphere already. But over 90% of the energy actually goes into the oceans. So here we are only talking about these kind of residual effects, which is the change in global mean temperature. And here you can clearly see, and I won't go much into this because we have talked about this earlier, there is natural variability every year, but you can see the trend is clearly it's going up. We have significant warming events that are turning also into extreme events. And if we look into the future, this is now from the new IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And you can see here that under all warming scenarios, so regardless whether we reduce emissions significantly, which is the top row, or whether we continue on a business as usual path is the bottom row, you can see here that in the near term, we will hit 1.5 degrees. This is what you see on the left-hand column. All scenarios, so these are all different scenarios on the left-hand side. In all the scenarios, we are going to see an increase of warming. And then it really depends on the scenario where we end in the long term on the right-hand side. You can see there, it's a real possibility that we keep global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees. These are the lower emissions scenarios, and the higher emissions scenarios, which are unfortunately still the more probable ones, could mean very significant warming of over 4 degrees by the end of the century. And you can see right now we are at roughly 1.2 degrees warming, and we have to observe already many changes in our climate, from heat extremes, from droughts, floods, etc., that are happening more frequently, more intensely. And this means that when the warming goes up to 1.5 degrees, we will see a worsening of the situation. So we have to be able to adapt to at least this warming of 1.5 degrees in the near term, because we will definitely see a worsening of the climate situation, requiring more adaptation. But then, as I said, it really depends on our actions now, what we do, where we end up with climate change. And you can see here the different scenarios. Also here, I won't go too much into detail. The gray lines here are the observed changes, and then these are the projections, and we are basically on this track of either the 8.5 or the 7.0 scenario, which means significant warming by the end of the century. And we should be here on this lower scenario, which are associated with lower emissions. Here the IPCC is showing us the different risks that are changing with different warming scenarios. So these bars are in association with the left-hand side temperature change. And you can see here unique and threatened systems such as coral reefs. They're also extremely under pressure under 1.5 to 2 degrees. And but the real greatest dangers lie when we go above 1.5, when we go above 2 degrees. So there, this is kind of the risk assessment that underlies the political commitment to the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 to 2 degrees halting of global warming. I'll give you some more examples why this is so relevant. When this last IPCC report was published, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, made very, very strong statements. He said, this report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a litany of broken climate promises. We are on fast track of climate disaster, and governments and business leaders are saying one thing but doing another. Simply put, they are lying. So this statement by Secretary General of the UN is a very, very, very strong statement. And unfortunately, he is right that while we have these political agreements to stop global warming, there's very little to underpin this. But now let me come to what probably interests you most, which is this question of how climate change affects conflicts and security. And here I want to comment a little bit on the question, how do climate and conflict interact? And there's very, very significant increase of literature since the last decade or so. We've seen many, many more papers investigating this, also connected to the fact that now we're seeing actually more climate impacts. So it's becoming more and more clear how these interact. So there's one very seminal paper saying there is evidence that the 2007 to 2010 drought contributed to the conflict in Syria. It was the worst drought in the instrumental record, causing widespread crop failure and a mass migration of farming families to urban centers. So before the protests broke out, that were then suppressed by the authoritarian dictatorship of Assad, before these protests broke out, there was extreme discontent, not only with the regime, but also with the situation that basically all livestock died in Syria. And people were displaced from rural areas into urban centers. And there, a competition also started around housing resources, around jobs. Then at the same time, this drought, of course, pushed the food prices up extremely. So the discontent with the regime accumulated together with the discontent about the livelihood deterioration. So you see these things happening in parallel and kind of firing into each other. And of course, there's moments of government intervention, and it's always a human decision to decide whether or not to take up arms, whether or not to return to violence. But you can see that the pressure on the system increases through climatic factors. So through droughts, the pressure, for example, increases. There was another study which was done by colleagues of mine at the Potsdam Institute. They found out that risk of armed conflict outbreak is enhanced by climate-related disaster occurrence in ethnically fractionalized country. So they looked at what preconditions kind of serve for a risk increase of conflict outbreak after a climatic extreme like droughts, for example. And they found out that especially countries that are ethnically fractionized, where there's a number of different ethnicities, maybe also living in polarized systems together, when these countries are hit, these are often also marked by weak governance, etc., and unequal distribution of resources and wealth. When these countries are hit by climatic disaster, violent outbreak becomes more likely. So this is their finding, statistical analysis. And then there's an expert elicitation that Machet al did, and they found out that experts agree that climate has affected organized armed conflict within countries. However, other drivers such as low socioeconomic development and low capabilities of the states are judged to be substantially more influential, and the mechanisms of climate and conflict linkages remain a key uncertainty. So it means basically, just to give you one example, when a drought hits 3 countries, maybe 2 remain stable and the third one may fall into conflict. So does this mean the drought was irrelevant? No, it means that there's many interactions that occur after drought hits. So for example, in Germany, we had also very, very significant droughts in the past year, very extreme heat events, also causing crop yield losses. And of course, we had a conflict because of this, but not a violent conflict. So we had a conflict of interest between farmers who lost their income, between the government, between the taxpayers, how much money they should receive to be able to continue being farmers and continue and don't have to close down their farming business and potentially migrate or something. So they received basically, they came to a compromise and they were able to come to a solution for this problem. But this has a lot to do with institutional, financial, democratic capabilities, the representation of minority, etc. So all these functions that we were able to resort to in Germany are not present in many other places. So if we now look, for example, at the Sahel, I did some field research in Burkina Faso, for example. So Burkina Faso on the left-hand side, maybe we focus on this. On the right-hand side is Chad. You can see here how the number of very hot days are distributed on the left-hand side in a kind of normal climate, and then how it would change over time if we go in different emissions scenarios. So the upper part is the RCP 2.6, a low emission scenario, and the lower part a high emission scenario, and then also associated, the high emission scenario is associated with higher levels of warming. And you can see here that especially the areas that don't have so many very hot days, so this means daily maximum temperature above 35 degrees, which affect yields, which affect productivity, because maybe some of you have also experienced the heat wave recently. Human productivity also reduces if it's extremely hot. So especially the areas in the south of Burkina Faso, which are more fertile, where it's more bearable, so to say, they will increase a significant amount of increase of very hot days in both warming scenarios, but of course, significantly more in the more extreme emissions scenario. And this also contributes to farmer-herder conflicts along ethnic divisions. So here you can see some images from our field research in Burkina Faso on the border to Mali. And what is happening there is, of course, also extremely complex situation. But one aspect of it is that Fulani herders are often marginalized and they are losing their economic base when they lose their cattle. And this makes them much more vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. Once for the economic reason that they are losing their income, but also for the reason of they're losing their identity, the herd size, being able to have cattle. It's all part of their identity, and this is being disrupted and it kind of deteriorates over time because of climatic disruptions. And this feeds into the conflict that is, of course, multi-layered, has many reasons, but this kind of feeds into the ongoing conflict, which is really has spread and accelerated in Burkina Faso, particularly in the last couple of years. We have dealt with this also in the ones to read more about climate risks in the Sahel. We've worked with the UNHCR and the UN Sahel group on these questions. How do all these complex things interact? We have summarized this so that people can use it when they are deployed to these areas or when they do research on these areas, and they can get an overview of how the climate is changing, what this does for security. Here you can see, maybe just to show you one more aspect of this, how summer heat extremes would change. So not the number of hot days, but summer heat extremes. So these are extremes on the upper part, which are unusual. So we call them 3 sigma events that are normally happening once every 740 years in a normal climate without climate change. So it would be quite unusual to witness such an event if you live in this area, but it's not impossible, let's say. And then On the lower part of this slide is here the unprecedented events that are virtually absent in these regions from the normal climate, meaning that they occur once every 3 million years, meaning no human has ever witnessed this type of event in this area. So because we have only been on Earth, as I said, maybe 250, 300,000 years. So these events don't occur normally. So now you can see the Paris consensus scenario. So this is the projection for June, July, August. Paris consensus scenario on the left-hand side and business as usual scenario on the right-hand side. And you can see on the business as usual scenario, we see an extreme increase of these events. So the unusual events would become normal, meaning that the dark red color means they would occur in 100% of summer months, meaning they would occur all the time in these dark red areas in June, July, August in 2080 to 2100. And even the unprecedented events, which could be prevented in a Paris consensus scenario where we are able to reduce emissions here, they could be prevented here. They would not occur in this scenario, but the unusual events would see a slight increase. And even these unprecedented events would become almost normal, occurring 60% of all summer months between 2080 and 2100. So this would mean a completely changed world, a completely changed climate. And of course, this has effects on agriculture, this has effects on the economies there, this has effects on the entire society. I will skip this, maybe just to emphasize this one more time, because it's a particularly interesting topic in the summer. We are reaching thermoregulatory boundaries of habitability. And actually, this is interesting because these measures for what are thermoregulatory boundaries, which are associated with the wet bulb temperature, are measures that were introduced through the military because they wanted to measure when soldiers are practicing, when they're out in the field, how much heat tolerance do they have. And they came up with an index that is both composed of temperature and also humidity, and also wind is also sometimes a factor. So to see that how long can a body withstand heat through sweating to regulate its own temperature. If it's very hot and humid, this boundary is reached, and you can see here that these are different scenarios again. You can see here in the business as usual scenario, so a high emissions scenario, the entire tropical belt would have on 300, 250, 300, 350 all year round days per year that are so hot that you would die basically if you are outside. You would die because it would supersede the wet bulb temperature. So these areas that are dark red or mildly red would become uninhabitable because it's not thinkable how to keep these areas habitable at a tolerable risk level. Yeah, maybe I can just mention this climate migration. There's a number of projections out there. People are already being affected by climate change and therefore are subject to move out of their areas. And most of these movements are occurring internally. It's called internal climate migration, and the World Bank is doing a variety of projections from a more climate-friendly projections where we would still see several tens of millions of people moving internally to a pessimistic scenario where we would see 200 million or more people moving until 2050. I think I will skip these parts, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the kind of governance issues that we're facing when we talk about climate and security. You have to think of three parallel crises at the moment. One is, of course, climate change, the overuses of fossil fuels. The other one is also a crisis that is connected to the overusage of natural resources. which is the COVID-19 pandemic, where we see that wildlife consumption, the destruction of wildlife habitats have increased the chance for zoonosis. And this is not only COVID-19, which is a huge crisis for the world, but it was also the case with Ebola. It was also the case with SARS, HIV. So basically, Pandora's box has been opened because of this overusage of natural resources, in this case, wildlife. And we are seeing the effects now, and we have to be prepared to answer to more of these type of crises. And then the last crisis that we have to deal with, address, major global crisis, is of course the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, which is also a driver of ecosystem loss. And I just want to mention this very quickly. Wars are of course also drivers of environmental destruction. They contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, attacks on fuel reserves, as you can see in the background. I think it's, is it Kharkiv? No, Odessa. And movement of troops and heavy equipment cause emissions, and the destruction of infrastructure and the need for reconstruction. And then, of course, also local environmental destruction, which was mentioned earlier as well. So toxic remnants of ammunition, attacks on industrial and chemical plants, destruction of land, so agricultural land, forests, species loss, soil degradation, freshwater contamination. So there's a number of environmental effects of war that we currently have to unfortunately witness in Ukraine. So the question also becomes, like, how can you reconstruct in a way that doesn't reintroduce the kind of fossil fuel dependencies that we all have in our countries, but if there's reconstruction happening in Ukraine, if there's reconstruction happening in places like Syria, Afghanistan, in Libya, how can buildings become more energy efficient? How can buildings be built with materials that don't consume as much CO2? Because if we use cement, this causes extreme emissions. If we use steel, this is very emissions intensive, etc. How can infrastructure for traffic become more climate friendly? So these are all questions that are on the table. So this is all not extremely new. It has been integrated into, and I'm coming towards the end of my talk here. This is has been discussed. I'm from Germany, so I will just give you some insights from this area. It has been discussed in strategic documents. So, for example, in this white book of the German Bundeswehr, German military, they also looked at health risks. They also looked at climate change. Also in the guiding principles on civilian crisis prevention and peace building, climate impacts and other non-traditional security threats such as pandemics are mentioned, but there was no concrete strategy what this means. So actually already years ago, all these things were mentioned. This is more than 5-6 years ago. But what this then actually means for people who work in the security sector, what this means for strategy, it was not really clear. So now Germany is formulating a new national security strategy. Maybe you've heard about it. And yesterday we had the consultation workshop. We organized it to bring together German government experts from different ministries, so defense, but also foreign ministry, other ministries, finance, etc., and security experts and climate experts to talk about how to integrate climate into the security strategy. And this is based also on Foreign Minister Baerbock's speech about the formulation of the national security strategy, where she outlines 3 elements of security: the invulnerability of life, so basically physical safety, absence from war, etc., the freedom of life, so the protection of our values, the protection of things like freedom of speech, and then also the protection of basic necessities of life, Lebensgrundlagen in Germany, maybe you can translate into livelihoods. And this last third point is very much related to the question of of climate change, the protection of agriculture, land, etc. And yes, I just want to highlight this. It has been said at the very, very beginning, this global transformation towards sustainability requires decarbonization in all sectors, including the security sector. And there is the NATO Green Defense Framework. There is this UNEP report on greening the blue helmets. There is the EU Climate Change and Defense Roadmap. So there are these first initiatives to think about green defense and think about also the advantages of less dependency on fossil fuels when in deployment, etc. The logistics of it are very complex, so there can be improvements and advantages in investing in this type of technology. But also the question, like if we invest in our militaries now because we need to, because of the Russian war of aggression, can we also think of these type of innovations, which then potentially could also have positive effects on the civilian side? This is my last point, and I thank you very much for giving me the time to make this intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, Kira, I have many thanks for your presentation. Shocking on one end, but also helping us to better understand, on the other hand, what the increasing levels of global warming might mean to us in the near future and the far future on top. The risk related to climate change and the projection you came up with, which makes me worrying, but it's also urging us to live up to the Paris Agreement. And the three aspects of instability you were talking about are very much in line with what the statement was of the NATO Secretary General I was referring to at the beginning of our meeting, talking about scarcity of food and water, talking about instability being caused and mass migration and being caused by the changing climate, finally leading to a set of effects described by you, such as ethnic conflicts, recruiting, and economic effects on top, among many others. Yeah, I see no questions related to your presentation at this particular moment, but I want to thank you again for also sharing the documents and literature with us. We will make sure that we find the links to the literature and we'll also post them within the chat. And having said that, I think we deserve a 5 minutes break. So let's have a leg stretch and be please back in 5 minutes time.